Welcome to Genos Historia, a channel dedicated to explaining the cool new things that DNA, especially ancient DNA, is revealing to us about the ancestral history of human populations. This video is episode 2 of my 9-episode series on Viking ancient DNA. In this video, I'll be looking at 10 ancient DNA samples from Viking Age Ireland, Orkney, and the Isle of Man. You obviously know where Ireland is, but you might not know where Orkney and the Isle of Man are. So for future reference, Orkney is a set of islands just north of Scotland, and the Isle of Man is an island between Britain and Ireland. These islands, as you should know from the history, were invaded and colonized by Vikings specifically from the country of Norway. So another way to describe what this video is about is to say that it's about 10 ancient DNA samples from Norwegian Viking communities in Ireland, Orkney, and the Isle of Man. You'll learn in this video that 9 of 10 of these DNA samples have what I can tell is Scandinavian ancestry, specifically from Norway, but that only 4 of them are 100% Norwegian. Most of the rest have mixed Norwegian and Scottish/Irish ancestry, which suggests that there was a lot of intermarriage between Norwegian Vikings and the Scottish and Irish people, which is not really a surprise at all. But before I really get into describing those DNA results, I need to make 2 things clear. The first is that these DNA samples come from the study Margarin 2020, and the second is that the opinions that I express about them are my own opinions based on what I've found studying them, mainly using the G25 PCA from the Eurogenes blog. They're not the opinions of the original study Margarin 2020. Okay, with that intro out of the way, let's get into this video. I want to first look at DNA samples from what we can tell are actual Vikings, not just ordinary people who lived in Viking communities in the British Isles. We know that they were Vikings because they have swords and other weapons in their burials. There are 4 DNA samples from burials of actual Vikings like these, 3 from Ireland and 1 from Orkney. The DNA results for these actual Vikings show that 2 of them are 100% Norwegian and 2 of them have mixed Norwegian and Scottish/Irish ancestry. There are 2 historical implications from these results from these 4 Vikings. The first is that because all 4 of them have at least some Norwegian heritage, this means that probably all Vikings, or at least most, active in Ireland and Scotland had Norwegian ancestry. None of them come 100% from the native populations of Scotland and Ireland. This may not seem like an important thing to most of you to mention, but there are definitely some people out there who would like to suggest that being a Viking had nothing to do with Scandinavian origins, but that it was just a job that people in the areas that Vikings were active in would do, no matter what origins they had. So this DNA refutes that idea, and so I needed to mention that. The second thing to say is that half of them, 2 of 4 of these Vikings, do, however, have mixed British and Irish and Norwegian ancestry. So these are 2 verifiable examples of mixed Vikings. This does not mean that people from the native communities would become Vikings. What it means is that people in the Viking communities would intermarry with people from the native communities in Scotland and Ireland, and then their mixed children sometimes would become Vikings. Another thing I want to say about these DNA results for these 4 Vikings in Ireland and Orkney is that notice that I specifically say that they have Norwegian ancestry, not generic Scandinavian ancestry. And I'm not saying this just due to the fact that it's well documented in the history that it was specifically Norwegian Vikings who invaded Ireland and Scotland. I say this because looking at their DNA, I can distinguish Norwegian ancestry from other types of Scandinavian ancestry. And so it's not complicated how I do this using the G25 PCA, but despite that, I don't have enough time to really explain it. But I can say it in the shortened version, which is basically what I do is I look at all of the 100% Scandinavian Viking age DNA samples. I compare them to each other. I find slight variation between them. I notice that the samples from central to south Norway plot on the western end of the variation. And then what I do is I plot the 2 100% Scandinavian Viking samples from Ireland onto this variation, and I notice that they overlap with the samples from central to south Norway, which confirms that they came from Norway. But there's another way that I tell that they're Norwegian, which is more interesting and more convincing, and that's their Y chromosome DNA. So both of the 100% Norwegian Vikings from Ireland belong to the Y chromosome haplogroup R1A Z284. And this haplogroup looking at the Viking Age DNA in Scandinavia is by far most common in central to south Norway. And still today, it's still most common in Norway. When I could tell when I looked at results from family tree DNA projects. So the presence of this R1A Z2A4 haplogroup in 2 Irish Vikings is a great way to confirm their Norwegian origins. Okay, so moving on. Lastly, let's look at the non-Viking DNA samples from Ireland, Orkney, and the Isle of Man. And when I say they are non-Viking, what I mean is there's no evidence that they are actual Vikings, but they did live in Viking communities in the British Isles. So there's 6 such samples, 1 from Ireland, 1 from the Isle of Man, and 4 from the Orkney Isles. The 2 from Ireland and the Isle of Man are both 100% Norwegian. They have the richest grave goods of all of these non-Vikings. Their isotope analysts suggest that they were born in Scandinavia, not the British Isles, so they are fresh arrivals from Norway. The one in Ireland was a female buried with fancy brooches with the zoomorphic style, which was popular back then. She had rich grave goods. And the one from the Isle of Man was a male. He was given a ship burial, and within his ship were the remains of many animals who were ritually sacrificed in his funeral, probably so they could go with him into the afterlife. So this was a pagan burial. He may have been a Viking, but there's no weapons in his burial, so we can't say for sure. I wanted to mention the context of the burials just because it's interesting and it kind of brings to life who these 2 people were. They're the wealthiest of the 2 non-Viking burials, and they're both 100% Norwegian. As for the 4 other non-Viking DNA samples, they all come from the Orkney Isles of Scotland, and none of them have rich grave goods, and none of them are 100% Norwegian. All of them were buried outside of churches and church cemeteries. 3 or 4 of them have mixed British-Norwegian ancestry, and 1 is 100% British or Scottish. So when you put this all together, looking at the non-Viking DNA samples, it seems that the most wealthy burials are the ones who are 100% Norwegian and who came straight from Norway, while the less wealthy ones are locals in the Viking communities in the British Isles who have mixed ancestry. We will need more samples to confirm this pattern, but that's just one thing that I noticed. To finish off this video, I want to give a few takeaways from these DNA samples from the Viking communities in Ireland, Orkney, and the Isle of Man to leave you off with. The first is, all but 1 of them, 9 of 10 of them, have Norwegian ancestry, including the 4 samples who are actual Vikings. And this confirms that these were actual Norwegian Viking communities. The second takeaway is that a high percentage of them do have Scottish/Irish admixture. 5 of 10 of them have this kind of mixed ancestry. And this confirms that there was a lot of intermarriage between the Viking communities and the native communities in the British Isles. Well, that's it for this episode 2 of my series on Viking ancient DNA. Stay tuned for my next episode, episode 3, where I'll be looking at Viking Age DNA from Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. Stay tuned for that.